Hey, my name is Shai and I want to show you this water shader I made. As you can see, it's an NPR procedural shader, and the fundamental fluid simulation is done using dynamic paint. I haven't seen many people use dynamic paint before, but it's a pretty cool tool. Dynamic paint lets objects interact with each other using a brush and canvas system, which makes it really easy to set up a fluid sim like this one. Just add your canvas, then brush, and tweak some settings to get the motion that you want. Okay, now we have an underlying fluid sim, but we need to build a shader for it. I'll assume this canvas is a plane with its object origin set up correctly. We'll take our object coordinates, use an absolute operation, and subtract on the x and y. And after these two operations, we can remove negative vectors with a maximum node. Finally, we can use a length operation to get this gradient. Now, with some simple math, we can transform this gradient into rings of waves and foam. We'll use a multiply operation. After multiplying, we can use sine, and this gives us a repeating pattern. Before we add any noise, we can use a float curve node right here. This adds some non-linear falloff, and you can use this to shorten the distance between waves as they near the middle. After I add a less than node to make a constant thickness, I added some noise to this original gradient, which will distort the phase offset of the waves. Make sure to use a map range node to adjust this effect, so you can also switch the zeros to negatives. Finally, we can add our frame data to this gradient. Instead of adding a new node, I'll add a multiply add, and switch the add-in to #frame. Don't forget, you can easily change the speed by dividing the frame driver. I'm also not really sure if they should flow inward or outward. You can change the direction by adding a negative sign behind the frame value. By default, you'll get these weird flashing effects in the middle. I added 2 more nodes to constrict the waves to only stay on the sides. Alright, now let's set up some shader interaction with dynamic paint. If we separate the z-axis from our object coordinates, we get this really useful height map. And we can actually use this to drive noise. Let's start by adding foam. In my shader, I want the tops of tall waves to be white to emulate real life. I did this by adding a Voronoi texture set to distance to edge, and only showing it when it's on a high peak. Here's a simple reconstruction of the idea. By doing this, we get some waves that form on the tallest parts of our canvas. I also made the foam less opaque when it's on a lower wave. I did that really easily with the multiply node. To add some more small irregularities to this shader, we'll separate the z-axis from our normals. Now we can plug it into a less than node and multiply this output by some Voronoi. So our Voronoi only appears when the normals don't point up. Here's a quick recreation of what we have so far. We've got some interesting wave splashing. So far, our waves are being built quite nicely, but we have no interaction between our canvas and the brush. And there are 2 main ways we can make this collision effect. Our fluid simulation collider is an icosphere. That means if we just bring our sphere's object coordinates using the eyedropper tool on the texture coordinate node, we can super easily get this nice distance gradient. Just like we did with these outer waves, we can turn this gradient into some nice rings. I did a multiply, sine, and then absolute operation to get double the waves, followed by a less than, since I'm going for a cartoon style. Repeating the process for our outer rings will add noise to this gradient to shift the phase offset. It should look something like this. You can actually repeat this process to make many waves with multiple different speeds. Let's take a quick look at our current shader. We can see that tall peaks are foamy, but we don't have that much in between tall waves and still water. So once again, let's take our z-axis and use the compare node to select strips of the shader at certain heights. Here you can see the wider and lower strip has a value of 0.25, and a thinner middle portion has a value of 0.75. They combine to get a value of 1. We'll use this mask to reveal some bubbles and irregularities. We can use a compare node on some Voronoi to simulate a small bubble pattern. Then we multiply them with the height strips to get this interesting result. Because of the dynamic paint, the waves actually bounce against the edges of the canvas. The only thing left to do is have all of these masks affect the color of your shader. And there's a lot of ways to do this. You could mix two states of your shader, the normal and the foam, and add them together to get a simple result. I recommend looking into the HSV node to manipulate the input color so you can always change the colors at any time. This is something that I implemented in my shader, so I can really easily switch the colors to red, green, or pink water. I can also separately change the foam colors, which is quite nice. Okay, now the shader is pretty close to the one on screen right now, but we're still missing a few things that take it to the next level. In my scene, I'm just using a sphere as my collider object. But if we use irregular geometry like Suzanne, our contact waves become completely inaccurate. That's because they're based off of the object origin, not their geometry. Since the contact waves are produced in a ring around the object coordinates, it doesn't really know anything about the geometry. This works for a sphere, but I'm guessing most people want some more complex interactions, so we can easily fix this using dynamic paint. Make sure to add a whole new dynamic paint operation by clicking the plus button to the right. That way you're not overriding the old wave simulation we have. I'll do that and make sure it's on the paint setting and switch our brush object from mesh volume to mesh volume plus proximity. And make sure to set up layer attribute under the output panel. Here in the shader, we can see the proximity attribute by adding a color attribute node in the shader editor. The result should look something like this, which is a bit annoying because this paint effect lasts so long. We can immediately see the difference between that length system we used earlier. It actually conforms to the geometry in a really nice way. It does linger quite a while though. That can be changed really easily using the dissolve setting. Now we have this time slider, and after fiddling with that, we can select how long the trails of the wave should be. I'm just using this scene to demonstrate the dynamic paint. The final shader doesn't look anything like this. As always, you can turn this gradient into any kind of wave using the multiply, sine, absolute, and less than. Then you can multiply this output with your original gradient so it doesn't span infinitely long. In my real shader, I actually toned this dynamic paint effect down. Since I'm using a sphere as my collider, I could just use the origin length method. There are videos like this one, which only use dynamic paint to get these contact waves. I'll leave this video either in a card up above or in the description. Before you click on that link, I did use dynamic paint for another system in the shader. I used it for some of these lingering bubbles. They aren't influenced by height, it's just turbulent water left behind this trail. For all of these noise textures, make sure to set the W slider to the frame as an input. Because it's water, it's most important that everything is dynamic. It'll add a level of motion to the shader so it doesn't look like ice. On top of that, each frame instance should have its own speed by dividing. That adds some character to each of the noise components. And as a final touch, I shifted some hues by the Z-axis to show some more depth. The deeper parts are actually a dark blue, while the higher we go, the lighter they get. This is a nice touch to keep things from feeling really flat, since everything's pretty blue. And with that, we should be done. This is actually a really fun simulation to mess around in. The dynamic paint adds so much intricacy that you could just move your mouse and watch things happen. Thank you so much for watching until the end. It means a lot. I will add a Google Drive link to this blend file in the description. Feel free to use it for any of your personal projects or just to mess around with nodes. But what changes or additions would you make to this shader? Let me know in the comments below.